The man is about to the most glorious moment of his life. After suffering for 5 long years, he has finally made it to the day the German forces surrendered. He drives his car with excitement, moving in the opposite direction of the surrendering German troops. As a Danish soldier, he finally understands what it truly means to feel proud again. While driving, he also spots a German soldier holding a German military flag in his arms, and angered, he immediately stops the car and scolds him. Seeing all the German soldiers staring at him, he continues speaking. Then he turns around and fiercely beats the soldier who is holding the German flag. Another German soldier who cannot stand watching tries to step forward to stop him, but he is also beaten badly. This hot-tempered Danish soldier is named Karl. 5 years ago, only a few hours after the war began, he received an order from his superiors to surrender. That burning fire of frustration has been spreading inside Karl for 5 years, and now he finally gets to release it. That afternoon, Karl receives an order assigning him to remove the landmines the German forces buried along Denmark's west coast. Soon Karl arrives at the minefield he is responsible for and carefully surveys it, and the soldiers assigned to remove the mines for him are all Germans. They are German prisoners kept by the Danish government and forced to clear the more than 2 million landmines the German forces buried along the coast. As long as there is even one landmine left on Denmark's long coastline, they are not allowed to go home, because the German army lacked manpower in the late stages of the war. Many of these German prisoners are teenagers who had only just been drafted, although they were not the ones who buried the mines. It is like planting trees for others to enjoy the shade. The ones who buried the mines are gone and the ones left behind must suffer. To make these German prisoners work better, the Danish government even gave them careful and patient training demonstrations. Even though the instructor explains mine removal knowledge very patiently and seriously, during live practice there are still people who make mistakes for various reasons and lose their lives in explosions. Every time Karl sees the members of his mine removal team, anger fills his heart because he hates German soldiers, a kind of hatred rooted deep in his bones. Therefore he humiliates these German prisoners in every possible way, doing anything he can to torment them, and whenever he is even slightly dissatisfied he gives them a hard slap. Looking at the long and wide coastline in front of them, the German prisoners instantly lose the light in their eyes because they know their hope of going home is extremely slim. The team is only 11 people but must remove more than 40,000 landmines, and even if every single landmine can be safely dismantled, it would still take a very long time. Not to mention that facing landmines every day means the slightest mistake could cause an explosion leaving nothing behind. Soon the team begins its tense mine-searching work. A boy holds an iron rod with a nervous expression, constantly poking into the sand, and with each poke he changes position, confirming safety before slowly moving his body forward. Many others repeat the same movement beside him. Soon one of the boys discovers something under the sand, and he slowly brushes away the soft dirt until a landmine appears right in front of him. The boy then tightens his nerves and begins the mine removal work, and after a period of careful and tense effort, he finally manages to dismantle a landmine successfully. These people are all German prisoners, and after the war ended, they were forcibly kept by the Danish government to clear the more than 2 million landmines the German forces had buried along Denmark's west coast. And this mine removal team has 11 people, and in the area assigned to them there are more than 40,000 landmines. And only after they clear all 40,000 landmines can they go home. The one in charge of watching them is a Danish officer who deeply hates German soldiers, and he not only treats these prisoners harshly but also makes things difficult for them in every possible way. And the slightest mistake results in a beating. At night when they sleep, in order to prevent the prisoners from escaping, the Danish officer Karl must carefully check their number every night and then seal the door with a wooden bar. In their daily life, he pays them no attention at all. These German prisoners have been removing landmines here for 2 days, yet they have not had a single meal. But as prisoners, they do not dare ask Karl for food, so they can only continue working on the beach with empty stomachs, to fill their stomachs. One boy sets his eyes on a little girl who lives near the minefield, and he finds a chance to approach her while she is playing with a doll, and in the moment she turns her head, he steals the bread from the little cart beside her. But one piece of bread cannot solve the problem, so the prisoners finally choose a representative to ask Karl for food. But Karl says that the war has just ended, and Denmark, which had been occupied and plundered for 5 years, is very poor, and the limited food must first be given to Danish soldiers and Danish civilians, and only if there is extra will it be given to German prisoners. Hearing Karl's words, the boy can only leave helplessly. That night, unable to bear the hunger any longer, the prisoners secretly climb out the window and sneak into a nearby barn to steal some feed. but they do not expect that they seem to have eaten something they should not have. The next morning, everyone looks weak and lifeless, and one boy who is already frail becomes dazed as if he has not woken up. He begs Carl to let him rest for half a day because he truly feels very unwell, but Carl thinks the boy just wants to slack off, so he orders him to continue removing mines. With no choice, the boy can only lie weakly in the minefield trying to rest in secret, and another boy also feels sick, and finally he vomits while removing a landmine. Seeing this, his friend hurries toward him in concern, but unexpectedly, with a loud boom, the boy loses both his arms and screams in agony. The other boys are already terrified and frozen in shock like statues. Most of them are new recruits, and just after they joined the army, Germany announced its surrender, and as prisoners they were forcibly kept by Denmark to clear the millions of landmines along the west coast. The tragic scene before them is especially shocking for this group of boys who have never been on a battlefield. Coming back to their senses, they quickly carry the injured boy away from the beach. They call helplessly for their Danish guard Carl, begging him to help them, but Carl, who has always hated Germans, stays inside pretending not to hear, listening to the injured boy's desperate cries outside. Carl's kind nature eventually pushes through his hatred, and he finally gets up and walks out. He first gives the injured boy a painkiller, then calls medical staff who take the boy away. That afternoon, many members of the team begin to suffer like the injured boy, feeling sick with unbearable stomach pain, rolling helplessly on their beds, and vomiting repeatedly. With no choice, they admit that the previous night, desperate with hunger, they had sneaked into a barn and eaten some feed, which caused so many of them to fall ill. Carl goes to ask the local residents, and he finally learns that the barn contains nothing but hay, and there is no feed like the prisoners described. Only then does Carl understand that what they ate was not feed but rat droppings mixed in the hay. The only thing Carl can do to help them is to find a way to make them vomit as soon as possible. The only boy in the team who is not sick gathers his courage and begins to speak out against Carl. He tells Carl that the war is over and that Carl should not treat prisoners as enemies anymore, and he says that most of their team are new recruits who never went to the battlefield and never harmed Danish civilians. The boy's words stir something inside Carl. Carl goes straight to the military hospital hoping to check on the injured boy, but the nurse tells him that the injured boy lost too much blood and did not survive. Hearing this, the feeling inside Carl begins to surge and expand, and he takes a large amount of food from the base and leaves. He does not want the prisoners under his watch to risk their lives again by eating whatever they can find. At this moment, the kindness in Carl's heart and the hatred pressed onto him by the past 5 years become tightly intertwined and clash fiercely. He brings the food, yet he still throws it heavily onto the ground, and his struggle between kindness and hatred becomes fully visible. Seeing the food scattered on the ground, the prisoners are stunned, and after 4 full days of hunger, they finally get to eat a proper meal. To their surprise, Carl even speaks to them in a slightly gentler tone and allows them to rest 10 minutes after eating before returning to the minefield. 3 boys strain to pull a cart loaded with landmines back to the camp, and every step up the steep slope takes all their strength. Although they are prisoners with no freedom, forced to clear landmines for Denmark, they still let themselves dream with hope, imagining that after returning home they will start a family-run weapons factory that makes landmines. With them are 7 other kids not much older, and they had barely enlisted before the war ended. After becoming prisoners, they were kept by Denmark to clear the landmines on the west coast, and so they live every day facing deadly explosives where the slightest mistake could cost them their lives. Not only that, they must also face accidents that may happen at any moment. That night, a pair of Danish soldiers suddenly burst into their barracks. The Danish soldiers dragged out a German prisoner, pressed him to the ground, then humiliated him, and even ordered him to open his mouth or they would shoot him. The other prisoners could only kneel aside in silent anger, watching helplessly. Fortunately, at that critical moment, Carl, the one responsible for guarding the prisoners, arrived just in time. Although Carl also hated Germans, he despised the Danish soldiers' behavior even more. He believed this was disgracing the Danish army, so he stepped forward to stop them.
This is my unit. My assignment is to clean the beach. I need these boys. I need all of them.
Seeing how firm Carl's tone was, the soldiers did not want to start a conflict, so they quietly turned and left. The next morning, the young prisoner soldiers returned to the beach to continue clearing landmines. A boy finally managed to remove one landmine and happily picked it up, but he had no idea that it was a chained mine. His companions heard the explosion and rushed over to help, but after circling the blast site several times, they could not find any trace of him, because the boy had been blown apart with nothing left behind. Hearing the shouts, Carl ran over and saw the chaotic scene and 2 boys holding each other and crying. And in that moment the kindness in Carl's heart finally outweighed his hatred. Seeing his best friend lose his life so suddenly, the boy who survived fell seriously ill for 2 days, and during those 2 days Carl took care of him with great attention. Carl, who had always hated Germans, finally began to slowly let go of that hatred. He began to realize that the war had ended, and the boys before him were also victims swept into the conflict. For the first time, he tried sitting with the prisoners and talking, trying to understand them and sincerely make friends. Before this, whenever the prisoners slept, Carl would always lock the door with a wooden bar, but on this day he finally pushed the wooden bar away. What had been locked was not the room, but Carl's heart filled with hatred, and at this moment he finally let it go. That day the prisoners reported that Minefield 237 had been completely cleared and was now safe, and the excited Carl immediately announced a day off, having fully let go of his hatred. He even played ball and joked with the prisoners in the safe area, but he did not expect that Carl's beloved dog would step on a landmine in the so-called safe zone and lose its life. Panicked, Carl rushed over, and looking at the dog's body, his heart was overwhelmed, as this was a dog that had accompanied him for 5 years. Carl paced back and forth inside his room, torn with grief, and after 3 long hours he convinced himself that the German prisoners he guarded must have deliberately left a landmine in the safe zone to make him step on it so they could escape. With that thought, Carl stormed out of the room, gathered all the prisoners, and ordered them to stand hand in hand in a straight line and walk across the entire safe zone. Some prisoners were too terrified to obey, which only made Carl more certain of his suspicion, and he slapped them hard and ordered that anyone who refused to walk the safe zone would be shot immediately. Then, with Carl's command, the prisoners linked arms and walked through the safe zone under the watch of 2 armed Danish soldiers. In the end, the prisoners safely walked across the entire safe zone, and the landmine the dog stepped on turned out to be one the prisoners had accidentally missed. Not something done intentionally, but Carl's extreme actions made the prisoners anxious and fearful, and some believed that if this continued, Carl would harm them all. One prisoner even wanted to escape, but he was tied up by several more level-headed prisoners. Most of them believed that with Germany having surrendered, there was nowhere they could escape to, as long as they were more careful during mine removal and did not miss anything again. Today's situation would not repeat itself. They eventually persuaded the prisoner who wanted to escape, just as they quietly promised themselves to be more cautious in removing mines and strive to go home sooner. A woman suddenly rushed into their barracks begging them to save her daughter, because the young girl had accidentally wandered into a minefield. The man suddenly realized the prisoners he was guarding were all gone, and only one sick and barely conscious prisoner was still lying motionless on the bed. The man hurriedly asked whether the others had escaped, but it was a false alarm. Because the prisoners had not escaped, they had run into the minefield to rescue the girl. When Carl reached the beach, he saw a prisoner carefully probing the ground with an iron rod, and although he was only a few meters away from the girl, every step was extremely dangerous, and he unearthed several landmines in a short time. As he slowly approached the girl, the frightened child kept trying to stand up and run toward her mother, and the mother could only desperately beg her to stay still. At that moment, the sick and confused prisoner also staggered toward the minefield. He crossed the wire fence and, ignoring everyone's shouts, walked straight toward the girl. Miraculously, he reached her without injury, and he gently spoke with her, calming her fear, and with everyone's cooperation, the girl was finally rescued. But that sick and dazed prisoner had endured enough of the fear and danger of clearing landmines every day, and he ultimately chose to walk away into the distance seeking release, ignoring everyone's cries. After this incident, Carl finally recognized the kindness of these German prisoners. The sick prisoner's death deeply affected Carl. He promised the prisoners that once they cleared the minefield under his command, he would send them home. Time passed day by day as the prisoners worked with caution, and that afternoon they were filled with excitement because after a long and difficult effort, they were finally close to removing all 40,000 landmines, which meant the day they would return home was near. Just as several prisoners were laughing and loading the removed landmines onto a truck, one landmine that had not been fully disarmed suddenly exploded. The prisoners working elsewhere on the beach saw the rising smoke and rushed toward the blast site. Hearing the explosion, Carl also ran there in fear, but all he saw was wreckage and thick smoke, and the prisoners loading the truck had all lost their lives with nothing left behind. 2 days later, the prisoners under Carl's command finally finished clearing every landmine, and Carl kept his promise and sent them onto the truck heading home. But unexpectedly, Carl learned that his superiors had sent 4 of the boys to the most dangerous scalding in Peninsula minefield. The casualty rate there was far higher than in the area Carl had overseen. Hearing this news, Karl was furious because he had promised the boys that once they finished the minefield, they would go home, but his superiors said that as long as there was even one landmine left along the entire west coast of Denmark, no prisoner could go home. Karl tried everything to beg his superior to let the 4 boys return home, and in the end, in anger, he even slammed his superior's desk. But no matter what he did, he could not convince them to change the order. In the end, Karl secretly forged a document, drove to the Skålingen Peninsula, and took the 4 boys away. He brought them to the border and pointed into the distance.
Die Grenze ist wahrscheinlich 500 Meter entfernt. Dann seid ihr in Deutschland. Lauf.
The boys looked at Karl in disbelief, then began running quickly toward Germany, running toward home. I am a movie enthusiast, and thank you for watching my channel. See you next time.